Her fish finder can tell you depth, temperature, and structure, but it can't tell you when something down there is watching back. Claire had always preferred fishing alone, not because she disliked people, but because solitude made every detail clearer. The line's faint vibration, the tiny changes in current, the way a lake could feel like two different places depending on the hour. She worked a steady job in a small Ohio town and spent most weekends driving out to whatever water she hadn't tried yet. The trip that stayed with her happened in late September, when the mornings sharpened and the air tasted like metal before sunrise. She picked a reservoir that didn't show up in most fishing forums. The map had it marked plainly, a long, dark shape squeezed between wooded hills, with a few access points and one neglected boat ramp. The reviews were sparse and unhelpful. A couple of people mentioned good base if you know where to go. Someone else posted a photo of a walleye on a stringer with no caption. The lack of chatter appealed to her more than any promise of a bite. Claire arrived before dawn, headlights sliding across the cracked ramp and the weeds that had taken the edges. The lake lay still in the dark, a broad sheet with no ripples, no distant engine noise, no porch lights. Even the insects seemed muted. She backed her small aluminum boat down, unhooked the strap and pushed off with a practiced ease that didn't require thinking. Out on the water, the world became a tight circle of light from her headlamp and the dim glow of her electronics. She ran a side imaging unit and a simple downscan. The screen painted the bottom in hard lines and soft gradients, drop-offs, scattered brush, a long submerged ridge that looked like an old roadbed. The reservoir had been a valley once. Everyone knew what that meant. There were things down there that didn't belong to a lake. Fences, foundations, maybe the bones of trees that had stood for a century before the water swallowed them. She cut the motor and let the boat drift near the ridge, keeping her distance from the steeper side. The depth read 19 feet, then 22, then a sudden plunge to 30. The water temperature hovered in the low 60s. She tied on a jig with a craw trailer, the kind of presentation that could tempt a base holding tight to structure. The cast sailed out into darkness, landed with a small splash that sounded too loud, and she began working it back with slow hops. At first, the lake behaved like any other. The line went slack as the jig touched bottom. She lifted, felt the tick of rock, then let it fall again. Her mind ran through simple, familiar calculations: angle, speed, bottom composition. The headlamp lit her hands. The reel handle, the damp sheen on the rod's cork grip. Somewhere in the distance, an owl made a sound that didn't echo so much as disappear. Then the fish finder chirped, one sharp beep she hadn't heard it make before. Claire glanced down. A thick arc had appeared on the screen, low and heavy, close to the bottom. It wasn't unusual to mark fish near a ridge, but this arc looked different, too wide, too continuous, like a moving wall instead of a single mark. She watched for a moment, expecting it to resolve into separate targets. It didn't. The thick shape slid along the ridge, maintaining the same depth, as if tracing the contour with intention. The unit adjusted sensitivity automatically, but the mass remained dense and clean-edged. Claire told herself it was a school of bait stacked tightly, or maybe interference from the thermocline. Yet the water temperature read clean. The surface stayed calm. Her line twitched. Not a strike. No sharp tap, no pull. More like the lure had brushed something that brushed back. Claire paused, lowered the rod tip, and felt through the graphite. The line vibrated lightly, as if a current had picked up around the lure, despite the stillness above. She reeled in to check. The jig came back intact, but the trailer looked scuffed. The soft plastic scraped, as if it had dragged across rough concrete. That made no sense. She hadn't been near shore. She hadn't touched any riprap. The ridge on the map was smooth. Claire switched to a crankbait, something that would run deeper and cover water, and made a cast parallel to the drop. The lure dug down and started its wobbling pull. Halfway back, the rod loaded with a sudden heaviness. Her pulse jumped. Finally, a bite. She set the hook. The rod bent, but there was no headshake, no frantic run. The resistance felt dead, like she'd snagged a log. She leaned back, tried to free it with steady pressure, then eased off and pulled again. The line moved, not toward her, not away, sideways, slow, deliberate. The boat drifted as the line angled. Her crankbait, buried in something unseen, was being carried along the ridge at the same pace as that thick mark on her screen. Claire tightened the drag and applied pressure, expecting the hook to pull free. Instead, the rod tip dipped lower, as if whatever had her lure had found deeper water and simply started descending. The line peeled out in a controlled, steady take, not a burst like a big fish, but a patient withdrawal. Claire's mouth went dry. She palmed the spool, feeling the braided line vibrate under her thumb. The vibration wasn't random. It came in faint pulses, evenly spaced, like distant machinery. The depth on the finder ticked upward as the bottom fell away beneath the boat. 30 feet, 35, 40. The thick mark stayed near the bottom, but another mark appeared above it, thin, vertical, rising like a narrow column. The unit struggled to render it, pixels shimmering. Claire didn't like what her mind offered her. A submerged tree? A stump? But a tree wouldn't move sideways with purpose. It wouldn't descend like that. It wouldn't create pulses in braided line. She made a choice that felt practical in the moment. She cut the line. Losing a lure was better than whatever this was. She reached for her clippers, leaned down and snipped. The tension vanished. For half a second, relief warmed her chest. Then, the rod tip lifted on its own, as if the line had been pulled back into place. Claire stared. The end of her braid, cut clean, should have snapped limp. Instead, it hovered taut, angled down into the dark water. Her headlamp trembled with her movement. She lowered it to see better, and the light made a thin, pale strand visible just below the surface. Not her braid, something else, like translucent filament, rising from the water and meeting her line end with unnatural precision. The clippers felt slippery in her hand. She jerked back and the strand tightened and followed, staying connected as if it had fastened itself to her gear. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She grabbed the braid and yanked. A small loop surfaced, pale and slick, then disappeared again. It didn't break. It didn't stretch like slime. It moved like it had structure, like a cord with muscle. Claire forced herself to breathe and reached for the trolling motor remote, ready to back away from the ridge. Her thumb hit the button. Nothing. The remote's indicator light glowed, but the motor didn't respond. She looked down at the bow. The trolling motor shaft sat still, submerged, as if locked in place. She tried again, harder, toggling directions. Still nothing. The lake remained calm, but her boat stopped drifting. It held position, pinned to an invisible point. She realized the bow wasn't just idle, it was being held. The boat's nose angled slightly downward, like the front had caught a soft current pulling it into deeper water. Claire leaned forward and shone her headlamp over the side. The beam cut through a few feet of water and then faded into brown-green darkness. The only thing she saw was a long pale streak, the same filament, moving in slow curves beneath the surface like a living line. Her outboard sat at the stern. She scrambled back, nearly tripping over a tackle box, and yanked the starter cord. The engine coughed, then fired. The sound felt too loud for the empty lake, like a shout in a church. She shoved the throttle forward. The boat surged, then stopped hard, as if it had hit a sandbar. The engine strained. The stern squatted, water lapping higher than it should around the transom. Claire killed the engine instantly, heart slamming, terrified of swamping herself. She sat frozen, listening to the water and the faint electric hum of her fish finder. The screen flickered. The thick mark had moved directly under her, centered beneath the boat, broad as a submerged truck. And now, on the screen, small marks appeared around it, multiple thin lines rising and falling like antennae. Claire's hands went numb. She tried to force logic over panic. The trolling motor could be jammed by weeds. The outboard might have caught a submerged cable or old fence wire. Reservoirs had hazards, stumps, lines, junk left behind, but none of those things would cut her line and replace it. None would hold her boat so cleanly in place without wind or current. She reached for a knife instead of clippers. The blade felt more final, more capable. She leaned over the side carefully, found the pale filament where it surfaced, and saw it clearly for the first time. Not a single strand, but a flattened ribbon that shimmered faintly, as if it had tiny fibers running lengthwise. It wasn't plant, it wasn't fishing line. It looked manufactured and organic at the same time, like something designed to mimic whatever it needed. She sliced down. The blade met resistance, then slid through with a wet, yielding sensation that made her stomach twist. The ribbon recoiled like a snapped rubber band and vanished below the surface. The boat drifted free at once, as if a hand had let go. Claire didn't wait to test anything else. She restarted the outboard and eased forward, keeping speed low at first, ready to kill the engine again if something snagged. The boat moved. Water opened ahead. She guided it away from the ridge, away from the steep drop, away from the center of the lake. But the fish finder stayed alive, and the screen kept telling a story she didn't want. The thick mark followed, not at the surface, not near her prop, but beneath her path, matching her direction. Each time she adjusted course, it adjusted too, staying behind and slightly below, like a shadow cast from the bottom up. When she increased speed, the mark lengthened, then tightened again, never losing her. Claire aimed for the boat ramp's faint outline, the dark gap between trees. The shoreline approached slowly, as if the reservoir had grown larger while she wasn't looking. Her headlamp caught the pale posts of an old dock near the ramp, leaning at a tired angle. She felt a tremor through the hull. Not an impact, not a bump. More like pressure changing beneath her, the way an elevator makes ears pop. The fish finder beeped again, and the thick mark rose a few feet off the bottom. The thin lines around it rose too, stretching upward. Claire's throat tightened. She told herself to keep moving, to not look down, to treat it like any other hazard and get to land. Yet some part of her couldn't help imagining those thin lines reaching for her boat like fingers. Another tremor ran through the hull, stronger. The boat yawed slightly, as if tugged from beneath. Claire corrected with the tiller, hands shaking. The shoreline was close now. She could make out the cracked concrete of the ramp, the weeds, the shape of her truck parked alone. Then the boat's stern dipped. Cold water slapped over the transom, soaking the back deck. Claire gasped and shoved the throttle forward. The outboard roared, and the boat lunged, throwing water behind it. The stern lifted, but something still pulled. The boat felt heavy, as if dragging a net full of rocks. Claire's eyes flicked to the fish finder. The thick mark wasn't behind her anymore. It was directly under the stern, pressed so close to the bottom of her boat that the sonar returned a bright, blown-out mass, as if the screen couldn't separate hull from whatever had risen to meet it. The thin lines around it stretched higher, and for one brutal moment the unit displayed them almost touching the surface. Claire's boat entered shallower water. The bottom rose fast on the screen. 20 feet, 15, 10. She could almost taste safety. The ramp, the concrete, the idea of stepping out and leaving the water behind. The pull eased slightly, like whatever followed her had to adjust to the rising bottom. Claire forced the boat forward, engine straining. The shore was just ahead, and the fish finder went blank, not powered off, not a loose cable. The screen showed a flat, uniform grey, as if the unit had suddenly lost the ability to interpret anything below. Claire didn't know which was worse, seeing the mark, or losing sight of it entirely. She kept moving anyway, guiding the boat toward the ramp with a desperate precision, trying not to think about the thing that had followed her this far, trying not to imagine it now in shallow water where it didn't belong. The hull shuddered again, and this time it felt like something scraped along the bottom, slow, testing, like a fingernail along a door. Claire's boat reached the edge of the ramp area, the water turning slightly clearer from the disturbed silt. She killed the engine and let momentum carry her, hands ready to jump. A final vibration ran through the line guides on her rod, the one she'd cut earlier. The rod tip twitched as if something had plucked it, and then just beneath the surface near the stern, a pale ribbon surfaced again, longer than before, curling up and away from the water, as if searching for something to fasten to. The ribbon didn't rise like a weed snagged and floating free. It lifted with purpose, the way a hand reaches for a railing in the dark. Claire moved before her brain could finish naming what she was seeing. She shoved the rod aside, grabbed the landing net from the deck, and swung it toward the pale strip as if she could scoop it and fling it back into the water. The net frame hit the surface with a hollow slap. The ribbon slid away from it, too quick for something that should have been passive, then curled toward the stern again, searching. Shallow water should have made the situation simpler. Instead, it made everything visible enough to confirm that it wasn't her imagination. The ribbon's edges were not smooth. Tiny frays ran along it like split fibers. It looked like something that had been torn from a larger piece, except it moved as if it remained connected to a hole below. The water around it didn't ripple naturally. The surface tension drew into faint stretched lines, as though something under the film was pulling it into shapes. Claire leaned over the stern and thrust the knife down again. The blade cut cleanly. The ribbon recoiled, sank, and for a second the water appeared normal, just disturbed silt and the boat's shadow. Then the stern dipped a second time, harder. The boat didn't just squat with weight. It tilted, as if the transom had been seized and tugged downward. Cold water poured in over the back edge and spread across the deck, soaking her shoes and the tackle boxes. Claire lurched forward, grabbed the bench seat for balance, and felt the aluminum hull flex with a low groan. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried through her bones, a complaint from metal forced into a shape it wasn't meant to take. She realized something with sudden clarity. Whatever had followed her had reached the ramp zone and still hadn't let go. Claire scrambled toward the bow, sloshing through an inch of water, and grabbed the rope she kept coiled near the cleat. She didn't bother searching for the dock. The dock was old and off to one side. The ramp itself was her target. Hard concrete. Friction. The one thing that might break whatever hold this was. She braced her feet and heaved the rope toward land. The rope arced and landed across the ramp's weed-choked edge. It didn't catch anything. She yanked it back through again, and this time the end snagged on something solid, one of the neglected metal posts near the ramp, half hidden in brush. Claire pulled hand over hand, dragging the boat inch by inch toward shallower water. The stern still felt heavy, but the concrete slope began to help. The hull scraped softly as it bumped the ramp's edge. She pulled harder, shoulders burning, the rope biting into her palms. The water at the stern surged again as if something had tried to yank backward. The boat shuddered, and for a split second Claire thought the rope would snap or the post would rip free. Instead, the rope held, and the boat lurched forward onto the ramp another foot. The lake behind her stayed calm. That calm was what terrified her most. No thrashing, no wake, no sign of a struggling fish or a submerged log being dragged. Just that steady, unnatural insistence, the pressure in the hull and the repeated dip of the stern, like something testing how much weight it could take before the boat surrendered. Claire dragged the boat until the bow kissed concrete and refused to float freely anymore. The stern still sat in water, but the angle changed. The pull weakened, not stopping but losing leverage as the boat's front found purchase. She jumped out, boots hitting slick ramp algae, nearly slipping. She caught herself on the post, kept the rope looped and hauled again, dragging the boat farther up. Water streamed from the deck, pouring back into the lake in thin sheets. As the boat cleared another foot of ramp, the stern rose. The pulling force didn't vanish. It shifted. The boat pivoted slightly to the left as if something in the water had moved to keep contact. Claire's headlamp beam cut across the surface near the stern. A pale shape rolled just under the skin of the lake. Not the thick, solid body she'd imagined from the sonar mark, but something like a broader field of those ribbons. Several strips moving together, weaving, braiding, unbraiding. The motion was quiet and efficient. It reminded her of kelp beds seen in ocean footage, except this was a reservoir in Ohio, and the water wasn't deep enough for that kind of mass to move without showing itself. One ribbon extended and touched the boat's transom. It didn't slap or bounce. Syed pressed flat, adhering in a way that made Claire think of tape. The ribbon's edge lifted and curled, seeking a seam, a bolt, anything to anchor to. Another ribbon rose beside it, and another. Claire yanked the rope and dragged the boat one more foot up the ramp, desperate to get the stern out of reach. The ribbons stretched with it, elongating like elastic but not thinning. They held their shape, as if they were designed to extend. Claire grabbed the knife with both hands and hacked downward at the point where the ribbons met the transom. The blade struck with a wet resistance. A faint vibration shivered through the handle into her wrists. The ribbons snapped back into the water, but the recoil wasn't random. The strips retreated together, coordinated like a net being pulled away. Claire didn't stop. She dragged the boat another foot, then another, until the stern finally cleared the water and scraped fully onto concrete. The moment it did, the lake surface smoothed again, erasing the disturbance as if it had never happened. She stood there breathing hard, headlamp beam swinging, waiting for the ribbons to rise again on land, waiting for some final proof that she hadn't just panicked over weeds and bad electronics. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a thin line of water began to seep from the boat's drain plug, darker than reservoir water should be, almost oily. It ran down the ramp in a narrow trail. Claire stared at it, confused, until she saw tiny pale fibers mixed in with the flow, short, frayed fragments of ribbon like torn cloth. She backed away from the boat without thinking, stepping toward her truck. Her hands shook so badly, she fumbled the keys once before getting them into the door lock. She climbed in, slammed the door and sat there with the engine off, staring at the ramp through the windshield. The boat rested on concrete, silent and ordinary looking, except for the faint line of dark water still bleeding from the hull. Claire forced herself to look at the lake one more time. Near the edge of the ramp, just where the water met concrete, a pale strip surfaced briefly, only an inch, like the corner of a ribbon caught by a breeze. It lingered, then slipped back under. The surface returned to perfect calm. When Claire drove away, she didn't hear anything. She didn't see anything following her in the mirrors. She didn't stop until she reached a gas station 20 miles away, and even then she left the boat hitched outside, refusing to look too closely at the transom. Later at home, she found something that made her stomach turn more than the lake ever did. One of those pale fibers had dried onto her trailer strap, stuck like a splinter of tape. When she tried to peel it off, it lifted in a single piece, strong, flexible, and faintly warm, as if it had only pretended to be inert. She sealed it in a plastic bag and threw it into the deepest trash bin she could find. By morning, the bag was empty. A shoreline can look harmless and still be the last clean edge of a place that shouldn't exist. Jordan picked the inlet because it was convenient, not because it was famous. He worked maintenance for a regional park system in western Pennsylvania. Trail repairs, restroom checks, dock inspections, the kind of job that taught him how quickly water could turn wood into sponge and metal into rust. He fished when he could, usually after work, and he preferred quiet corners, where the parking lot emptied early, and the only sounds were frogs and the soft clack of his tackle box lid. The inlet sat off a larger lake, connected by a narrow channel that bent through cattails and flooded timber. Locals called it the back cut. It was shallow near the mouth, then dropped into a trench that ran alongside an old stone embankment, remnants of a rail line that had once carried coal. The embankment was half collapsed now, stones sliding into the water like broken teeth. Jordan arrived on a Wednesday evening with a single rod, a small backpack, and a headlamp he hoped he wouldn't need. The sun was still up, low enough to cast amber light through the trees. He walked the short path to the bank and paused, scanning. He noticed the smell first. It wasn't the usual lake smell: mud, algae, warm vegetation. This was sharper and cleaner, like wet limestone or a freshly opened basement. It made him think of cold air rising from a storm drain. Jordan shrugged it off and stepped closer to the water. The surface looked normal, faint ripples from insects, a few drifting leaves. He could see a line of submerged branches near the far side, a perfect place for bass to hold. He tied on a spinnerbait, the kind that could be fished fast and still trigger a reaction. The first few casts were uneventful. The lure thumped steadily, blades flashing just beneath the surface. He worked along the bank, aiming for gaps in the branches, letting the bait tick wood now and then. On his fifth cast, the spinnerbait came back coated in something that looked like clear gel. Jordan reeled in, frowned, and pinched at it. The gel stretched into a strand between his fingers and then snapped. It wasn't slime from a fish. It was too clean, too uniform, almost like softened glue. He wiped it off on grass and cast again. The next retrieve felt wrong. The blade vibration, normally a steady pulse, became irregular, like the spinnerbait was bumping unseen obstacles. Jordan slowed down, trying to let it ride higher. The lure still thumped unevenly. Then the line tightened. Jordan set the hook out of habit, expecting a bass or maybe a pike. The rod loaded heavy, and for a moment he felt the satisfying weight of something big. But the fish didn't run. It held. Jordan leaned back, boots digging into dirt, and felt the line hum with a deep, low vibration that traveled up the rod blank and into his forearms. The sensation didn't match a snag. Snags were dead. This was active, steady, like tension maintained by something that could adjust. He tried to pop it free with a sharp pull. The line moved, sideways, not drifting in current, sliding, controlled, pulling the lure along the trench as if it had been hooked to a conveyor. Jordan stared at the water, trying to spot what had him. The surface showed nothing, but the cattails at the mouth of the inlet quivered faintly, bending as if a slow swell had passed beneath them. Jordan loosened the drag, deciding he'd walk along the bank and change the angle. He stepped left, then right, watching the line's entry point shift. The resistance responded to his movement as if it anticipated it, keeping the same tension, guiding his lure deeper into the trench. Jordan's maintenance job had taught him what old places hid: cable, rebar, illegal dumping, abandoned equipment. The inlet's trench ran beside the collapsed railbed. There could be metal down there. Something could have snagged him and was now sliding because of shifting debris. Still, that vibration didn't make sense. Jordan reeled down and pulled again, harder, preparing to break off if he had to. The rod bent nearly to the handle. The line sang. The water near the entry point dimpled once, as if something had nudged the surface from below. A small bubble rose and popped, then another, then a line of bubbles, evenly spaced, moving toward shore like someone walking underwater. Jordan stepped back without thinking, shoulders tightening. The bubbles continued until they reached the shallow lip near his boots, and then they stopped, hovering in place for a second, as if waiting. The surface went flat. Jordan's spinnerbait surged upward out of the water, not launched, not jumped like a fish shaking free. Lifted smoothly, as if something below had raised it on the line. It hung an inch above the surface, dripping, blades spinning lazily. Jordan froze, staring at the lure suspended by tension alone. A thin, clear strand surfaced beside the line and touched it, not wrapped accidentally, touched deliberately, making contact like a probe. Jordan could see it now in the angled sunlight, a filament that looked like stretched glass fiber, almost invisible until it caught the light. The filament slid up his fishing line. It moved with a steady pace, climbing toward the rod tip. Jordan jerked back and yanked the rod high, trying to lift the line out of the water entirely. The filament followed, clinging, rising above the surface without breaking. It didn't drip like water. It didn't sag like weed. It held shape like something engineered. Jordan stepped backward again, and the filament climbed faster as if his retreat encouraged it. He reached down for his pocket knife, fingers clumsy, eyes locked on the line as the clear strand advanced. The filament reached the first guide on his rod. It threaded itself through without snagging, sliding cleanly, as if it already knew the path. Jordan's chest tightened. He didn't waste time trying to cut his line near the reel. He snapped the rod sideways and smashed the blank against a rock at his feet. The graphite cracked with a sharp sound. The line went slack. The spinnerbait dropped into the water with a small splash. For a moment, Jordan thought that had ended it. Then the broken tip section of his rod twitched on the ground, dragged an inch toward the water and stopped. Something pulled at it, as if testing the weight. Jordan stared at the rod piece, then at the water, then at the trench line marked only by darker surface color. The inlet stayed quiet. The cattails didn't sway. No bird called. Jordan backed away, step by step, keeping his eyes on the water's edge. The broken rod tip dragged another inch toward the lake, scraping dry dirt. Jordan turned and walked faster, then faster still, until he reached the path. Behind him, the sound of something sliding over mud followed. Soft, steady, patient. Jordan didn't sprint. He didn't shout. He didn't do anything dramatic that might turn a bad feeling into a foolish accident. He walked fast, controlled, the way he moved at work when he knew a slope was slick and the wrong step could put him in a hospital. The path rose a little, winding between scrub and young trees. The inlet remained visible through breaks in the brush, flat water, cattails, that darker band where the trench ran. The late sun had dipped further, turning the air cooler and making the shadows lengthen until they felt like objects. The sound followed him. It wasn't loud enough to be obvious at first. It was a faint drag, a soft scrape on wet soil, like a heavy rope being pulled through mud. It started and stopped, always resuming after his next few steps, never rushing, never losing him. Jordan reached the small wooden footbridge that crossed a drainage channel. The boards were warped, the handrail splintered in places. He'd repaired it once himself, hammering in new nails after a storm had knocked debris against it. Crossing the bridge meant leaving the immediate edge of the inlet and heading toward the parking lot. He stepped onto the boards and listened. The drag sound had moved closer, now clearly on the path behind him. Not footsteps, no rhythm, no weight transfer, just that continuous slide, as if whatever traveled didn't need legs. Jordan's throat tightened. He forced himself not to look back. Looking back felt like permission. He crossed the bridge and reached the other side. The parking lot lay about 100 yards ahead, a rectangle of cracked asphalt surrounded by trees. His truck was the only vehicle. The drag sound stopped. Jordan's shoulders didn't relax. Silence didn't mean safety. Silence meant it was doing something else. He reached the edge of the lot, keys already in his hand, and finally glanced back down the path. Nothing stood there. No person. No animal. Only a line of disturbed dirt where something had been pulled, faint but visible in the low light. A shallow groove running toward the bridge. The groove ended at the bridge. Jordan's eyes dropped to the boards. Between the planks, something clear and thin had threaded itself upward from below, like fishing line catching in a crack, except it wasn't random. Multiple strands had risen in parallel, spaced evenly, forming a loose fan that touched the underside of the handrail. The strands shimmered when the sun hit them, then vanished when his angle shifted, as if they only existed when light agreed to reveal them. Jordan backed away one step, then another. The strands moved, not flapping in wind. They slid along the bridge boards, exploring, tasting. One strand stretched toward the center of the bridge, then dipped between the cracks and rose again a foot closer to him, as if it had learned the bridge's structure in seconds. Another strand touched the rail and then curled around it, not gripping like vine, but adhering like thin tape. Jordan turned and went for his truck. He didn't run until he heard the first board creak, one single creak that sounded like weight shifting onto the bridge. The boards complained again, then again, slow and steady, as if something heavy was spreading itself across the planks without steps. Jordan ran. His boots slapped asphalt. His hand shook so badly he missed the lock on the first try, then jammed the key in and yanked the door open. He dove into the cab and slammed it shut hard enough to rattle the glass. For a second he sat there, gasping, staring through the windshield, expecting to see something come out of the path. The lot stayed empty. Then the truck rocked, not from him moving. A firm jolt, like someone had leaned their full weight against the bed. Jordan twisted and looked through the rear window. A clear strand clung to the tailgate seam, barely visible except where it caught the light. Another strand had found the bumper's edge and ran along it like a measuring tape. The strands weren't thick. They were nearly nothing. Yet the way they lay against metal made his skin crawl, like something intimate was happening to his truck without his consent. Jordan jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered once, then started. He threw the truck into gear and hit the gas. The truck surged forward, and then the rear dipped as if something had grabbed the bumper and pulled down. The tires chirped. For a heartbeat, the truck didn't move. Jordan pushed harder on the accelerator. The engine revved. The truck lurched forward, breaking free with a snap that sounded like a rubber strap releasing. The rear window showed the strand still attached, stretched thin and gleaming. It trailed behind, like a tether, extending farther than any fishing line should without breaking. It remained connected to something back near the bridge, anchored to the inlet's unseen trench. Jordan kept driving. The lot ended in a narrow road that curved through trees. He didn't slow for the turn. His headlights came on automatically as the forest swallowed the last of the daylight. The strand behind him stayed taut, a faint silver line cutting through the dark. Jordan's mind tried to rationalize it. Old plastic, a prank, a strip of packing tape caught on brush. But tape didn't stretch like that without snapping. Tape didn't pull down the rear of a truck. He glanced at the rearview mirror again. More strands had joined the first. 2, then 3, then a cluster, each one shimmering briefly in the headlight's spill. They looked like clear cords pulled from a giant spool. The cords braided together and unbraided, adjusting tension, distributing load. Jordan felt a surge of anger cut through fear. Anger at the violation, at the absurdity. He reached down, grabbed the tire iron from under the seat, and cracked the rear window an inch. Cold air rushed in. He shoved the tire iron out and tried to hook the strand to yank it off. The moment metal touched the clear cord, the cord tightened and vibrated. The vibration traveled up the tire iron into Jordan's hand, not like a pluck, but like a humming current. His fingers went numb instantly, as if they'd touched a live wire. Jordan dropped the tire iron onto the seat with a harsh gasp and slammed the window shut. The road straightened and ran alongside a long fence line, the park boundary. Beyond it, a few scattered houses and farther the faint glow of a small town. Jordan pushed the truck faster, eyes fixed on the road. The strands behind him began to whip slightly with speed, but they didn't break. They adjusted. Some slackened, others tightened, as if the thing at the other end was learning how the truck moved. A mile from the inlet, the truck's interior lights flickered. Jordan's stomach dropped. The radio crackled once, a burst of static, then went silent. The dashboard display dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again in uneven pulses. He had worked long enough around wiring to know what electrical interference looked like. Loose battery terminals, failing alternators. But this wasn't random failure. The pulses matched the vibration he'd felt in the rod earlier. Steady, intentional, like something sending a signal through the line. Jordan's headlights flickered. For 2 terrifying seconds, the road ahead disappeared into darkness. Then the lights snapped back on. In that brief blackout, Jordan had seen something in the beam's afterimage, something pale crossing the road far ahead, not solid, more like a curtain caught by wind. It vanished when the headlights returned, but the impression remained. The strands weren't only behind him, they were ahead too. Jordan slammed the brakes. The truck skidded slightly, tires squealing on the road's damp edge. He stopped hard, chest heaving, staring into the headlight's cone. Nothing stood there. The road was empty. Jordan looked in the mirror. The strands behind were still present, stretched and gleaming, but they weren't vibrating now. They were perfectly still, as if waiting for him to make the next move. Jordan understood something then. Not as a clear thought, but as a pressure in his skull. The thing didn't need speed. It didn't need pursuit the way an animal would. It had already connected to him. It had his truck. It had his path. It had learned the geometry of bridgeboards and rod guides and tailgate seams with a precision that felt practiced. Jordan did the only thing he could think to do that didn't involve finding out how far it could go. He cut himself loose. He threw the truck into reverse, backed up sharply toward the fence line, then swung the front end into a wide turn that put the truck perpendicular to the road. He stomped the gas and aimed straight at the fence. The fence was old wire mesh on wooden posts. The truck hit it with a crunch and tore through, metal screeching as the mesh dragged along the bumper. Jordan kept driving, bouncing over uneven ground. He didn't care about property lines. He cared about breaking the clean line the strands had formed along the road. In the mirror, the strands tightened suddenly, trying to follow the new angle. The cluster stretched and pulled sideways, rubbing against the torn fence mesh. The mesh caught some cords, snagging them. Jordan drove harder. The cords strained, shimmering brighter as they stretched over the fence wire. For a second, they looked almost white, visible like spider silk under flashlight. Then, at last, one snapped, not with a pop, but with a wet, tearing sound, like fabric ripping underwater. Another snapped, and another. The rear of the truck lifted as tension released in stages. Jordan kept driving across the field until he reached a gravel driveway leading to a farmhouse. He didn't stop at the house. He kept going until he reached a paved road again and the glow of streetlights. Only then did he slow, hands cramping around the steering wheel. The dashboard lights steadied. The radio returned with a faint hiss. The truck stopped rocking. Jordan pulled into a lit gas station and parked beneath a bright canopy. He climbed out slowly, body trembling, and walked around to the back. Fence mesh hung torn from the bumper like shredded netting. Embedded in it were a few short, clear strands, fragments, each one stuck in place like hair caught in a thorn bush. They didn't droop. They held their shape, rigid now, as if they'd hardened the moment they separated from whatever controlled them. Jordan stared at them and felt the cold basement smell again, stronger than before. He grabbed a pair of gloves from his truck bed, yanked the mesh free, and dumped it into the station's trash bin. The clear fragments came with it. He watched them fall, expecting them to cling, to reach, to reconnect. They didn't. For the rest of the night, Jordan drove with the rearview mirror tilted away. In the weeks after, he avoided the back cut. He told his supervisor the footbridge needed repair, that the boards were warped and unsafe. He didn't mention the clear strands. He didn't mention the way the truck lights had pulsed like a heartbeat. But one afternoon, while inspecting a completely different dock on the far side of the lake, he found something that ruined the comfort of distance. A thin, clear filament stuck to the underside of a cleat, shimmering only when he moved his head just right. It looked like nothing. It behaved like nothing, until it slid, almost imperceptibly, toward the warmth of his hand. Jordan stepped back and left the cleat untouched. He locked the dock gate and wrote in his report that the hardware needed replacement. That night in his driveway, he found a small, clear strand caught in the tread of his boot, like a thorn that hadn't been there when he left work. It came off in a single piece, and it was faintly warm. A stranded lure is supposed to mean rocks, timber, or bad luck, not a response. Kendra chose the river because it didn't look like a place where anything could hide long enough to matter. It was a wide brown ribbon running behind a string of warehouses in Indiana, a working river with barges, pilings, and the constant low thrum of industry. The banks were a patchwork of gravel, crushed concrete and scrubby grass that never quite grew tall, beaten down by wind off the water and the foot traffic of people who came for catfish after shift work. She had learned to fish in clean places first. Small lakes, farm ponds, weekend trips where the worst surprise was a snapped line or a hook in the thumb. The river behind the warehouses had taught her something different. It taught her that water didn't need to be beautiful to be alive. The fish here were heavier, meaner, adapted to a world of rust and runoff. The bites, when they came, were decisive. Kendra arrived before sunrise, parking where the gravel widened near a chain-link gate. The gate stood half open, not welcoming so much as forgotten. A faded sign warned about trespassing, but the tire ruts and footprints in the mud said people ignored it. The air smelled like cold metal and damp cardboard. Somewhere nearby, a forklift beeped once, and then fell silent again. She walked with her gear down to a break in the bank, where concrete slabs had collapsed into the river, forming a rough stair-step into the shallows. The water there was slow enough to fish, but close to a deeper channel marked by the way the surface darkened and flattened. That channel was where the catfish traveled, big ones, especially when the water cooled. Kendra set her backpack down and assembled her rod without rushing. She tied on a rig she trusted, a sliding sinker, a thick leader, a circle hook with a chunk of cut bait that bled slowly in the current. The bait had a sharp smell, even through the plastic bag, the kind of scent that felt like it belonged more to decay than to food. The first cast landed in the darker seam with a dull plunk. The sinker settled. She tightened the line until it bowed slightly, then rested the rod on a forked stick wedged between stones. For a while she simply watched the water and listened to the quiet, the strange quiet of an industrial place before day fully started. The river's surface moved in long, unhurried folds. Trash drifted past now and then, a plastic bottle, a scrap of foam, spinning slowly in the eddies near the broken concrete. A gull circled once overhead and disappeared toward the warehouses. The rod tip dipped. Not a bite, just a light tremble. Kendra adjusted the line, thinking the sinker had rolled. The tip steadied. Then it dipped again. 3 small pulses evenly spaced. That rhythm made her frown. Fish didn't test bait like that. Not catfish. Catfish committed. They swallowed, they ran, they bent rods until your wrists ached. Kendra lifted the rod, reeled in a turn, felt the sinker drag, and then something caught. The resistance wasn't abrupt, like a snag. It was soft at first, like the hook had buried into weeds. The line vibrated with a faint hum. Kendra raised the rod higher and pulled gently to see if it would break free. It moved, not toward her, not away, sideways. The line angle shifted as if something down in the channel had taken her rig and started walking it along the bottom. The sinker should have stayed planted. The current wasn't strong enough to do that. There was no barge wake. The river looked the same. Yet her line, taut and alive, slid left with a calm persistence. Kendra tightened her grip, kept the rod tip high and began reeling to regain control. The reel turned, but the line didn't come in. Whatever held her rig maintained distance, giving just enough to keep tension, but not enough to let her retrieve. The rod tip dipped harder. The blank bowed. Kendra's pulse kicked, equal parts excitement and unease. A big fish could feel like this at first, heavy, uncooperative, dragging the line along the bottom. But the movement was too steady, too smooth. No headshake, no surge, no sudden change in speed. The line kept sliding. Kendra stepped along the broken slabs to keep her angle, careful not to slip. The riverbank here was unforgiving. A wrong step would mean a fall into cold water, thick with silt and hidden debris. She moved slowly, rod held high, watching the line cut into the surface. As she shifted, something happened near the point where her line entered the river. The surface dimpled once, not like a fish gulping air, but like something pressed up from below and then released. A small ring spread outward and vanished into the river's folds. Kendra stopped. She stared at the dimple's fading ring and felt the air turn colder against her face. The sunrise was beginning to lighten the sky, but the river channel still looked like a single dark stripe. She reeled again, harder, trying to force whatever it was toward her. The rod bent deeper. The line hummed, vibrating in her fingers through the cork. The vibration wasn't erratic. It came in pulses, perfectly timed, like a signal. Then the pull changed. The rig stopped moving sideways and began to rise. Kendra felt the sinker lift off bottom. The weight came up as if someone had hooked her line and was elevating it, careful not to snap it. She leaned back to counter, but the line kept coming upward, drawing her hook and sinker toward the surface. The river broke in a small bulge. Her leader emerged first, slick with water. Then the sinker, then the hook, except the hook wasn't free. A translucent strand clung to it. At first it looked like monofilament caught on her rig, the kind of line fishermen left behind that sometimes snagged your gear. But this strand was flatter than line, like clear tape stretched thin. It caught the growing light and shimmered with faint internal fibers, barely visible like threads embedded inside. The strand didn't hang limp. It held tension upward, pulling her rig higher until it hovered at the surface, dripping. Kendra's stomach tightened. The river around the rig stayed calm. There was no fish thrashing, no wake, just her gear suspended by something nearly invisible. The clear strand slid along her leader. It moved upward like it was climbing, passing the knot without snagging, gliding over it with unsettling ease. It approached her main line, where the leader connected, and continued without hesitation. Kendra reacted with instinct rather than thought. She reached down, grabbed the line above the rig, and yanked. trying to jerk everything out of the water in one motion. The strand followed. It lifted free of the surface with her line, still clinging, still climbing. It didn't stretch thin like slime, it didn't drip like weed. It behaved like a material with its own stiffness, its own goal. Kendra stepped back quickly, hauling line in hand over hand, trying to get distance between herself and the water's edge. The strand advanced toward her rod guides. When it reached the first guide, it slid through it without resistance, as if it had already learned the shape. That detail hit Kendra like a shove. Even a loose piece of tape would snag, fold, catch an edge. This didn't. It threaded cleanly. She dropped the line and grabbed for the knife clipped to her tackle bag. Her fingers fumbled once, then found the handle. She snapped it open and lunged toward the line where it crossed in front of her. The blade met the clear strand and hesitated. It didn't slice cleanly the way it should have. The strand resisted, not like tough plastic, but like layered fiber under tension. The knife bit in and the strand vibrated hard. The vibration traveled into the blade, into her wrist, a faint buzzing that made her grip feel unreliable. Kendra forced the cut through. The strand tore with a wet, ripping sensation that made her teeth clench. The cut end recoiled instantly, snapping back toward the river with whip-like speed and disappearing beneath the surface. Kendra's line went slack. Her rig dropped onto the slabs at her feet, sinker clacking on concrete. She stood there breathing hard, staring at the water's edge, waiting to see the clear strand rise again. The river flowed like nothing had happened, slow and indifferent. A bottle rotated in an eddy. A distant engine started somewhere upriver. Kendra could have packed up then. Leaving would have been the sensible thing, but the absence of a visible threat made her doubt herself. A piece of discarded packaging caught on her hook, a strand of industrial material in the water. Something strange but still explainable. She cleaned the rig, retied the leader, and cast again. This time a little farther out, closer to the center seam. The sinker landed with a soft plunk and disappeared. She tightened line, set the rod, and waited with her knife still in reach. Minutes passed. The rod tip remained still. Kendra exhaled, feeling her shoulders loosen slightly. The light grew stronger. The warehouses began to wake. A truck rumbled somewhere behind the trees, its sound dull and distant. Then her rod tip dipped once. A single, heavy pull. Kendra's hands tightened on instinct. The line went taut. The rod bowed. This felt more like a fish. A big one. Heavy. Slow. Testing. She lifted the rod and began reeling carefully, letting the circle hook do its work. The tension held, strong and steady. The line vibrated faintly, but she told herself that could be the sinker bouncing along rocks. She reeled a few more turns. The tension increased without warning. The rod bent so deeply she felt it in her forearms. The line cut the water at a sharper angle, pulling not out toward mid-river, but down, straight down, as if her rig had been dragged into a hole. Kendra stepped back, bracing, boots slipping slightly on damp concrete. She lowered her rod tip to lessen the strain, trying to keep from snapping. The line continued down, drawing her rig deeper. The water in front of her changed texture. It didn't ripple. It tightened, flattening into a smooth patch as if the river there had been sealed. The smoothness spread outward in a slow oval, wider than her cast point, erasing small surface movements. Kendra stared at the smooth patch and felt her mouth go dry. Rivers were never that smooth. Not here. Not with current. A small bulge formed in the center of the smooth patch. Not a fish surfacing. Not a log rolling. A rise from below, controlled and rounded, like something pushing up against the surface film and holding there. The bulge trembled once, then steadied. Kendra's line, still taut, began to lift again. Her leader emerged, dripping. The sinker appeared. The hook followed. This time the clear strands were not just one. Several translucent ribbons surfaced together, weaving around her rig in coordinated loops. They moved like hands working in water, quick and precise, wrapping, anchoring, adjusting. One ribbon touched her leader, then slid upward. Another pressed flat against the sinker as if testing its shape. Kendra backed away, dragging the rod with her, trying to pull her rig onto land before the ribbons could climb. The ribbons rose with it, stretching above the surface without breaking contact, following the line like climbing vines made of clear fiber. Kendra lifted the rod high, trying to keep the ribbons from reaching the guides. It didn't matter. The ribbons reached anyway, extending with unnatural length. They touched her main line several feet above the water, then slid upward faster, as if proximity to air made them more efficient. Kendra brought the knife down on the line, intending to cut cleanly and drop everything back into the river. The blade hit the line and severed it. The cut end of her line should have snapped back toward her rod tip, whipping harmlessly. Instead, the cut end held tension. It hovered in the air, pulled forward as if still attached to something beyond the break. The clear ribbons, now visible in full, clung to that severed end with a precision that made her heart stutter. They had connected themselves to her gear the moment she cut it, replacing the missing length like a splice. Kendra stumbled backward, nearly falling, eyes locked on the severed line end that refused to fall. The ribbons vibrated, and the vibration traveled up her rod blank into her hands with the same timed pulses as before, steady, deliberate. Then the river responded. The smooth patch widened abruptly, spreading toward the bank like a slow, silent tide. The waterline crept up over the lowest slab. A thin sheet flowed across the concrete, without the usual gurgle and splash, as if the river had become heavier. Kendra stepped back again. Her boot sole left a wet print, and in the print, in the thin water sheen, she saw faint pale fibers drifting like hairs. The ribbons tugged, not hard enough to yank her in, just enough to make her shift her weight, just enough to teach her that they could. Kendra tightened her grip on the rod, knife still in her other hand, and felt a sudden certainty that the river was no longer a background element. It had become a mechanism, a system. The clear ribbons reached the first guide. They slid through, and Kendra realized with cold dread that cutting line wasn't a solution anymore. Whatever this was, had learned her patterns in real time. Kendra's first impulse was to drop everything and run, but the river had already made movement part of the trap. The clear ribbons had reached her first guide, and the moment they slid through, the tension changed. The rod didn't merely bow under weight anymore, it bowed under alignment, as if the pull had found the exact angle that kept her muscles working against themselves. The vibration pulses traveled up the blank in clean intervals, turning her grip into a metronome she couldn't ignore. She cut the line again, pure reflex, bringing the knife down in a fast chop near the rod's midpoint. The braid snapped. The severed end didn't recoil. It held its shape in the air for an impossible second, stretched forward, taut, as if the missing distance had been replaced by something that refused to be seen head-on. The ribbons tightened at the cut point and drew the remaining length toward the water. Not yanking, not jerking, simply reclaiming it. Kendra dropped the rod. It should have clattered and rolled on concrete. Instead, it dragged. The handle scraped across the slab with a rasping sound, moving toward the river's edge, like a slow animal pulling itself forward. The rod tip angled down, following the invisible tension. The guides clicked faintly as the clear ribbons passed through them. Kendra's breath hitched. She seized the rod handle with both hands and hauled it back, muscles straining. For a moment, she won, pulling it away from the waterline by a foot. Then the pull answered, firm and precise, and the rod slid forward again, not faster, just stronger, as if the thing below had adjusted leverage and decided it no longer needed to negotiate. Kendra let go. The rod skated across the wet concrete into the thin sheet of river water creeping up. The river's smooth patch widened further, a matte oval where current seemed to stall and hold its breath. The creeping water moved over the slab edges without sound, coating everything in a film that looked thicker than water, almost syrupy. Kendra backed away from the edge, boots slipping slightly on the slick surface. She kept the knife up, not for defense in any rational sense, but because having something in her hand made her feel less like prey. The rod reached the lowest step and stopped, half in water, half on concrete, trembling as tension pulsed through it. The clear ribbons were visible now whenever the growing daylight hit them at an angle, flat strands with faint embedded fibers stretching from the rod's line path down into the smooth patch. They didn't flutter, they didn't drift, they maintained geometry. Kendra snatched her backpack and took 3 quick steps up the slabs to higher ground. The river's film followed, creeping up a fraction more, as if drawn by her movement. The thin waterline formed a clean edge around her boot prints, and in that edge she saw pale fibers again, hair-thin, drifting within the film like shavings suspended in resin. A bulge rose from the smooth patch. This time, it didn't tremble and settle. It rose and held, a rounded swell that pressed the surface film upward, as if something broad and flat had lifted a shoulder against it. No splash, no gurgle. The surface tension stretched and shone, resisting a rupture. Then, at the swell's peak, several clear ribbons surfaced in a sudden coordinated lift. They didn't lash. They didn't whip. They extended. The strands arced toward the bank, fanning outward in a spread that looked like a net being cast from below, except it moved in silence and precision. The leading edges searched the air, finding the nearest solids, the rod handle, the gaps between slabs, the lowest weeds at the bank. One ribbon slapped onto the concrete near Kendra's feet. It adhered instantly, flattening, then curling at the edges as if tasting the texture. Another ribbon landed beside it and began sliding, not as if pushed by wind, but as if pulled by an internal motor. Smooth, steady, purposeful. It moved toward the darker patch of wetness where her last step had been. Kendra retreated higher, heart hammering, and the ribbons on the concrete changed direction with her movement, tracking as if they could sense where her weight shifted. She turned and ran. The bank above the slabs was rough gravel and broken stone. She sprinted toward the path leading back to the gate, backpack bouncing, knife clenched so hard her fingers ached. Behind her, she didn't hear footsteps. She heard something worse, the soft, continuous slide of multiple strands, dragging across wet concrete, then onto gravel, then into dry grass. The sound was faint but constant, like tape being pulled from a roll that never ended. She reached the path and vaulted a low barrier of brush. The industrial yard beyond was waking now. A distant truck rumbled. A mechanical whine started and stopped. Normal sounds, human sounds, but too far away to help. Kendra ran toward her car. The parking area was a flattened patch of gravel near the chain-link gate. Her car sat alone, dull in the morning light, windshield filmed with dew. She fumbled the keys and got the door open, nearly tearing her nails on the handle. She threw the backpack into the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel. For one breath, she expected the car to feel safe by default. It didn't. Safety required separation, and she didn't know whether separation was possible anymore. She turned the key. The engine cranked and started, but the dashboard lights flickered once in a way that made her stomach drop. Not a normal flicker. A pulse. Steady, evenly spaced, like the vibrations on the rod. Kendra shoved the car into reverse and backed hard away from the water access point. Gravel sprayed. The tires caught, and she swung the front end toward the exit. As she accelerated toward the gate opening, the rear of the car dipped subtly, as if extra weight had settled onto the trunk. The steering wheel felt heavier, the way it does when a tire is low. Kendra glanced in the mirror. A thin, clear ribbon clung to the edge of the rear bumper, barely visible except where it caught dawn light. Another ribbon traced the seam of the trunk lid, pressed flat as if it had always belonged there. It didn't flap in wind. It stayed fixed, holding tension backward toward the river. Kendra's throat tightened. She accelerated. The ribbon stretched. It didn't snap. It extended behind the car in a single glimmering line that stayed taut, cutting through air like spider silk under a flashlight. The line held so perfectly that it looked like a guide wire anchoring her vehicle to the river itself. She hit the road and increased speed. The warehouses blurred to her left. The industrial river vanished behind trees and concrete barriers. The ribbon remained, now joined by a second, then a third, thin, clear cords that braided together and separated, distributing pull the way a tow strap might, except nothing visible connected them to anything solid behind. The rear of the car rocked once, not from a pothole, a single jolt, like something testing the limits of attachment. The car's interior lights flickered again. The radio display, which had been off, flashed and then went dark. Kendra drove faster. The cords behind her brightened when her brake lights reflected off them, revealing their embedded fibers like faint internal stitching. The sight was brief, but enough to confirm what her body already knew. The ribbons weren't debris. They were active. They adjusted. They learned. Kendra aimed for the nearest busy stretch of road, where more cars meant witnesses and light and noise. She merged into traffic, keeping her speed high but controlled. She didn't look at other drivers. She watched the mirror and the space behind her, waiting for the cords to snap under strain. They did not. Instead, the cords began to shorten, not by retracting toward the river, but by drawing closer to the car like a slackening leash that no longer needed to stretch because the thing holding it had moved with her. Kendra's breath caught. The river was miles behind. Nothing could be following on foot. Yet the cords in her mirror stopped angling backward and began to angle downward, toward the road itself, as if their anchor point was no longer behind her, but beneath her, sliding along the asphalt in her wake. A faint shimmer appeared on the roadway behind her car, only visible in the right light, a smooth patch darker than surrounding asphalt, like a wet stain that moved as she moved. It didn't spread like water. It held shape like a shadow with edges too clean. The cords tightened again, now pulling not backward but downward. Subtle at first, then steady, compressing the rear suspension by inches. Kendra's car began to feel sluggish, like it was towing something heavy. The engine worked harder. The steering fought small corrections. She didn't head for home. Home meant driveway, quiet, a place where the car would sit still and be examined by whatever had latched on. She aimed for the most crowded place she could think of without slowing. A large shopping center with bright lights, cameras, constant movement. She exited, crossed an intersection, and turned into the parking lot under tall lamps. The lot was already filling with morning customers. People walked with coffee cups, carts rattled, doors opened and shut. Kendra parked under a light so bright it made her squint, pulled into a space near the store entrance, and killed the engine. The moment the engine died, the car rocked once more. Not violently, a settling motion, a quiet confirmation. Kendra stayed still, hands on the steering wheel, listening for any sound that didn't belong. A scrape on concrete, a slide under the chassis, a faint tearing. The normal parking lot noise washed around her and made her feel exposed rather than protected. She forced herself to get out. The air outside smelled like exhaust and baked bread from the store's vent. Ordinary. Comforting in theory. She crouched at the rear bumper and looked. The clear ribbon was still there. It ran along the bumper seam and then down beneath the car, disappearing under the undercarriage. In the bright lot lighting, she could see more of it now. Multiple strands layered together, pressed flat like a bandage applied by something that didn't understand it was not allowed to touch. Kendra reached toward it with the knife. The moment the blade came close, the ribbon tightened and vibrated, and the vibration traveled through the air in a way she felt more than heard, an unpleasant buzzing pressure behind her eyes. The ribbon did not retreat. It did not flinch. It simply held itself ready as if contact was what it wanted. Kendra didn't cut it. She withdrew the knife and stood, back stiff, scanning the lot. Nothing looked unusual. No one watched her. No one reacted. The ribbon remained nearly invisible, unless light hit it just right, which meant most people would never see it. She grabbed her backpack and walked into the store with the same body language as everyone else, trying to blend into the flow of shoppers and fluorescent aisles. The brightness inside felt harsh. The air conditioning raised goosebumps on her arms. She bought random items without thinking. Water, paper towels, a pack of batteries, anything that made her look normal at the register. Back at her car, she loaded the bags and sat again in the driver's seat, breathing hard through her nose, forcing control back into her hands. She started the engine. The dashboard lights pulsed once in that same timed rhythm. Kendra drove straight to a mechanic, a place with open bays and concrete floors stained by years of oil. She pulled in and parked near the entrance, choosing a spot under the brightest light again. When she stepped out, she looked under the rear bumper. The ribbon was gone. Relief hit her so fast it made her dizzy. She crouched lower, checking seams, checking the undercarriage. Nothing clung there, no clear cords, no shimmer. The car looked normal. Then she saw her own shadow on the concrete. It was not shaped quite right. Behind the rear tires, where her shadow should have been a clean silhouette, faint thread-like extensions reached outward across the floor, barely darker than the concrete, like a fan of hairline cracks that moved when she moved. The lines weren't attached to the car anymore. They were attached to the space beneath it. A drop of water fell from the rear bumper, even though the car had been dry. The drop hit concrete and didn't splash. It spread into a small, smooth patch, glossy as if the floor had been sealed. A thin, clear filament rose from that glossy spot and lifted toward the underside of the car, searching. Kendra stepped back quickly, heart slamming, and the filament followed her movement without touching her, adjusting its angle like a compass needle finding north. The glossy spot widened a fraction, still silent, still controlled. Kendra backed away again, faster, and the filament rose higher, reaching toward the warmth of the engine bay, the metal of the chassis, the rubber of the tires. In the open garage, under bright lights and with people only a few yards away, the river had found a new way to be present. Kendra turned and walked out of the lot without the bags, without the knife, without looking back at the car again. Her steps stayed steady, but every muscle in her body felt like it was waiting for a tug. Behind her, the glossy patch held its shape. The filament continued to search, and in the harsh daylight it looked less like something drifting by accident and more like something assembling itself, piece by piece, wherever she tried to leave it.